My computer has a problem this morning, but I think we are good now.
Oh, that's fine. That's not a problem.
Yeah, yeah. How is everyone there?
Good, Bhushan. How are you?
Good, good, good.
I put the talk of a link on in Twitter too. So let's see if someone else is joining.
Yeah, I saw that. Thank you. Yeah, that's good. That's good. This is an opportunity with co-learning, and we all can teach each other. This is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now let me just bring up my slides, and that is what I do. There we go. Do you see my slides?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So I guess Nandini requested that I do this talk again because this is what I did in the master class. I guess some of you were there on the master class.
Some of them did attend, I suppose.
No, sir. Only we fellows. But the thing was like that it was very busy, so none of us were able to join. I joined in the middle of the class, so I felt it was very good. So
Okay.
I thought can
Yeah,
have it.
good, 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 good. So I'm going to use the same slides and we'll go through the same thing because I think it is foundational and important. So, and I'm going to talk about ventilation or ventilator induced lung injury as it is now called, and patient self-inflicted lung injury as it is also now becoming famous. No conflicts of interest. Let's go back. I like this paper all the time. Lancet, 1967, when Ashbag, Bigelow, Patty, and Levine, they coined this term, acute respiratory distress in adults. It was still not, it was the first time anybody defined a new syndrome. How often that happens in medicine. That was what the last decade was all about. What they basically did is defined or showed 12 patients with varied etiology. You can see here multiple trauma, lung contusions, shotguns, viral pneumonia, and all of those, who all of them came with an acute respiratory distress, which was acutely in onset. It was not chronic. They did not have it as background. They came with hypoxia, and a lot of them were fluid positive already, fluid overloaded. They had acidosis and they had hypotension. And they went on to describe that this is something unique. This is an acute lung injury, which mimics the neonatal respiratory distress syndrome. And so we call it as acute respiratory distress in adults. Many may not know that the paper was not always accepted in all the journals. And in fact, one of the reviewers thought that this was something called respirator lung. The term respirator lung was famous then, especially after the pandemic of the polio, where children or adults who had polio who went on to the positive pressure ventilator then died, were found to have lungs that were terribly injured. There was no business why polio should have bad lungs. So they concluded that these lungs were badly hit because of the ventilator, because of the positive pressure. And they used to call it as respirator lung, which is to say VILI, nothing else. Which means that, even when the term ARDS was being coined, VILI was a contender. VILI was a contender to its differential diagnosis. Now we know that acute respiratory distress syndrome presents as acute respiratory illness. It has pulmonary inflammation and edema, which is biologically something like diffuse alveolar damage. So it comes as hypoxemia, and that is how we define it clinically. But biologically, it is alveolar damage. And the presence of that edema and inflammation is in the absence of left heart failure, which is very, very important because is it heart or is it the lung? That was the basic question for centuries, and that kind of is almost sorted. It was a relatively recent paper in JAMA from the adult world, encompassing 50 countries after they redefined ARDS in 2012. The mortality in adult ARDS, even with the new definition, has been 30 to 50%, which is pretty high. And then in 2009, after redefining the pediatric ARDS, we had this party study which showed, depending on how we look at it, the pediatric mortality can be 15 to 30%, depending on where it is, etc., etc. This is pretty high mortality for an acute illness in both, whether it's pediatric or an adult. The real question is why? Why is ARDS such a easy way to die? This is a diagram that I showed you last time, I believe, from Irene Thelias's chapter. We know that ARDS is all this, right? We just discussed. But VILI, which is the way we treat ARDS, which is this part, is by offering a ventilator, where the ventilator takes care of the patient acutely, gives us survival, achieves gas exchange, offloads muscle work. It also adds to injury, which is volu, baro, atelecto, and biotrauma. We'll go through some of these terms today. Whatever it does, it produces a picture which is similar to this picture of ARDS. For instance, if I have to study ARDS in the laboratory in animals, all I need to do is give them VILI, bang their lungs with very high tidal pressures, or whatever form of injurious ventilation I would like to use, and it will produce inflamed, leaky, edematous lungs, which is basically ARDS, and then I can study whatever therapy I want to study. Which is to say that your friend, the positive pressure ventilation, which is taking care of this sick lung, is also adding injury. And this is the problem. So ventilation in ARDS is one side, there are two sides of the same coin. One side of the coin is that there is life support from mechanical ventilation, without which the patient will certainly die. On the other hand, your friend, the ventilator, adds injury to the lung, and adding injury to the sicker organ will take the patient towards death. So it is where we give adequate life support, but we prevent lung injury, is the balance that we need to achieve with mechanical ventilator. And that's the entire purpose of why certain numbers have to be targeted, why you keep pressures below some limits or tidal volume, etc., etc. But this is the fundamental philosophy. Now, there are certain classic concepts of VILI, as we know, as distension trauma, which kind of goes together with, for the both terms of barotrauma and volu trauma. Then atelectasis, which is closed lung. And then there is biological trauma, which is inflammation in the lung and distant to distant organs. I will add some newer concepts, one of them, which I've been working on, and then this concept of PSILI, which again, part of it has been done in our laboratory at Snippets. So, classic concepts. My purpose today will be to go through some very classic and old papers. If possible, read through these papers. It'll enlighten you. It'll bring up some different idea of where everything starts. You know, we get taught 6 versus 12 ml per kg. That's a comma after which we learn. But where did it all start? Why did we come to that place? And it has come through rigorous work, preclinical modeling, etc., etc. And it's just actually taken decades to reach to this point where we try to practice safer ventilation. Now, this is a paper that gets famously quoted in all the papers of VILI or ARDS at times. This was done in Boston back in 1970. This was a paper where a balloon model of an alveolus is being prepared. It's it was an elasticity model where you're trying to study stress distribution inside an alveolus. Basically, these are small balloons which have been hexagonally, which have hexagonal arrangement, and they've been made into a larger hexagon. And this is an alveolar unit, and these are small alveoli. Basically, these were small condoms at that time. What they were studying is the stress distribution in the central alveoli or the central balloon when the pressure surrounding that central alveolus has been changed from either 0 to 20 centimeters of water. Now here you can see, I don't know if I can reduce this. Oh yes, I can. Sorry about that. Tomorrow. So here is what the central result is. If you look at this blue circle, this is the the situation, which is closed loop, not the dotted one, is the PV loop of the central balloon when the pressure surrounding that balloon is 0. What we see is for it to distend from 0 to say 200 ml, it has to go from 0 to a little bit about 20 centimeters of water, or maybe close to 25 or 27 centimeters of water. Now, when you change the pressure around that alveolus to 20 centimeters of water, and then you study the pressure volume curve of the central alveolus, then it goes from -60 to +27 to achieve the same tidal volume from 0 to 20. That is huge. So they concluded that the central unit in the condom model when the pressure around 0.20 is different, saying that the stress distribution in this lung will depend on the stress of the surrounding tissue. This forms the basis or the push towards understanding VILI. And this was soon after the ARDS was being defined or recognized. This interested several people, but none more than this paper made a huge impact on our understanding of VILI. There were two colleagues, Webb and Tierney. What they did is took rats and started ventilating them. Rats with normal lungs. These are normal adult rats who are completely healthy, have no lung injury whatsoever, or any form of disease. Here's their central result. They ventilated these rats on pressures of 14 by 0. A simple experiment, 0 end expiratory pressure, 14 of peak pressure. They ventilated them for an hour. They took the lungs out. The lungs look fantastic. There's no problem. There's no leak. The lungs have not gotten into any trouble. They had serially increased pressure. The maximum pressure they gave, keeping the end expiratory pressure 0, was 45 centimeters of water. At 45 by 0, you can see what has happened to the lung. The lung has become hepatized. Animals did not even last the whole hour. It was 20 or 25 minutes that they started dying. It was red, inflamed, thick, edematous lung, leaky with blood in it. So they said, okay, this much of pressure is what kills a rat. One of them was clever enough to add a PEEP of 10, said, okay, if this is edema, because by that time edema was being understood, and it was understood that, okay, they said it as, they called it as experimental pulmonary edema. And for pulmonary edema from cardiac or any cause, giving little bit of CPAP was able to hold patients at that time. So they said, let's keep this pressure same. They had multiple other sets of pressures, which I'm not showing, but this was their central result, which the picture they showed. They added a PEEP of 10, but they kept the peak pressure same as 45. And look at the result. The lung has changed. It came towards 14 by 0. And the animals lasted a whole hour. When they brought them out, they were a little heavier. These lungs are heavier than these lungs. There was some water in it, but they were nowhere close to dying. For hemodynamic consequences, of course, they were hypotensive, etc. But from lung injury perspective, these lungs were similar to these lungs. So now it brings to the question, is it the peak pressure? So even if with the 45 of pressure, if you had a PEEP of 10, you were able to keep the lungs going. Or is it the absence of PEEP, or what it is? They couldn't conclusively make a complete justifiable argument of why this and why not that. But they landed on something that really made everybody thinking. This was back in the ARRD, which was then the name of the Blue Journal, American Review of Respiratory Disease. And it's so, this is the paper that made the most impact, has been cited many, many times. And it actually shaped research on how the ventilator and the lung interact biologically, or what form of injury would happen from the ventilator. Almost a decade or more later, this is the model of 45 by 0 that people started working on. That, okay, there is a problem that the lung goes through when it's been mechanically ventilated, and we need to understand this more. What Webb and Tierney said was that this is pulmonary edema. And back then, pulmonary edema means hydrostatic pressure, means water leak, etc., etc. Come 1985, Dreyfus and colleagues said that, well, if it was such hemorrhagic and such quick death, we don't think this may be just water. This is leak. There must be something else happening. So they went on to study the same model and showed that Within 5 minutes of 45/0 ventilation in rats, the endothelium starts to rupture. These are endothelial blebs, very early endothelial injury. And by 20